Such a pleasure to have the four of you here for this conversation. Maybe we could start with some introductions. If you could say who you are, what you do, and how you sort of come to feminist work, what kind of feminist work you come to. Gorata, would you like to start?
My name is Gorata, and I am a feminist researcher. At the moment, I'm researching sexual violence, the impact that it has on people who experience it, as well as how we can really take or create, rather, support systems for people who've experienced sexual violence. And how I come to this work, I would say, through a lot of other feminists. I think it's like contagious if you're around feminists long enough. And yeah, and also just through rebellion, I think, is what I'd say.
Rebellion, like which kind? More precisely.
Oh, so when I say rebellion, what I mean is that I think to be a feminist is to rebel against a lot of things and to have to question a lot of things. So the rebellion that is of anytime you question something or someone tells you that's just how it is and you disagree, that kind of rebellion.
Well, my full name is Noma Pakade. Most people call me Noma. I'm just fascinated by knowledge production and sharing. I like the idea of being a researcher. I'm currently working on my thesis looking at Black women's narratives of freedom. And I'm restless with that question precisely because I identify as a Black feminist. And we're at a point in time, at least in South Africa, where so many things are supposedly available. And there's this change that we need to testify to, yet, as Black women, there's just so many contradictions that go as far back as 1950s, mid-1950s, if we consider the first Women's Charter. I don't know when I started being a feminist, but I've always been surrounded by interesting women that inspired me to be curious about life. I do also a lot of work in research and education, but I wouldn't go as far as that's my feminist work. I think feminism for me, it's the practice of the everyday. It's the church and what I eat and what I pray and who I choose to fuck and love and hold and be with. I'll leave it at that for now.
Love it. Love it. Tumi?
I'll start with how I became a feminist, then talk about my work. So for me, feminism has always been about self-work. It's always been something that started from the inside of me. Every time I thought that I would think that I'm taking a foot wrong, it would be feminism that helps me to map my way back to find where I want to be, where I'm supposed to be, and even in terms of how I relate with other people, it's been feminism that's been my guide in that. And I would say that I felt that way probably since I was a child. In high school, I went to an all-girls convent school. So feminism saved my life, I would say. Yeah, and the work I do, because again, like I said, it's always been, I always start to work it in from the inside before I try to project it out or to preach it to other people. So at first, the research that I was doing was very focused on Pentecostalism and women in Pentecostalism, because I grew up in a born-again household. My mother's a pastor, and so was my father at some point. So it was the kinds of questions that I had around that, around the messages that are given, how they affect women, how the women in those churches use them to live out their own lives, and I came to a lot of very interesting answers, because then it became more than just about me. It started with me, but it became so much more and so much bigger. And now I'm increasing my work to include township women, women who live in the township, whether they were born and raised there or who have recently moved there for work purposes, and to see how they live out their lives and where my own feminist theory fits into that, if it does at all. You know, if it also needs to be adjusted so that it suits them and the choices that they want to be able to make for their lives. Yeah.
Thank you. So I thought that was very interesting. Feminism saved my life. It sounds like that song last night, a DJ saved my life, right? Yeah, so I'm Sharlene Khan. I'm a visual artist and scholar based at Wits University. So I came to feminism sort of formally when I was doing my first MA at Wits University, but I think like most people's stories, it's something that you sort of innately sort of know about yourself, because you're sort of riling against so many things when you're a young person that like the world kind of doesn't make sense in the ways it does to other people, whether it's authority figures or the kinds of structures, everyday structures, like, you know, why do I have to do these chores while my brother doesn't have to do these chores? Or why do I have to take home economics and typing, and these are stupid subjects, those kinds of things. So it was always that kind of trajectory. And then eventually you find that there's this kind of word, feminism, and then it's like, oh, okay, I understand that there's this set of politics that actually works to question why the world has been structured according to these ways. And then when you get to feminism, you then also realize that as a person, as a woman of color, it didn't quite fit into my set of politics as well as a racialized body. And so sort of feminism, white feminism, Western feminism didn't sit with me. And so I became disillusioned with that. And by a happy accident, there was a talk on campus by Betty Govindan on black feminism, which, as is the case with me, I missed. But I sought her out, and then she introduced me to sort of the work of Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks and to Pumla Gola. And so that very exciting journey and that life-altering journey changed, and that's how I came to sort of black feminisms and African feminisms and post-colonial feminisms and became homed in that space.
I want to pick up on several things that have happened. The first one is, and maybe I'll put them together, rebellion and freedom. Because I think like Sharlene, what you've said about, like for me growing up, I knew I'd heard of the word, but it wasn't like something that I was like, oh, this is the word for me. I didn't know if I was rebellious. I just knew that something's wrong with everything that's happening around me. And so I would have thoughts and feelings about it, and then I would negotiate my way into, you know, what's prescribed and expected, but also being like trying to negotiate or navigate something, you know, around it. I don't know if I was rebellious, that's what I'm saying, but but certainly I may have been perceived as rebellious, even if I was just like, no, I'm just living and I'm just perceiving. But I guess then the question of freedom was then to be able to articulate a vision. And when you say freedom, and I'm like, because freedom is then something, so not only my individual freedom, but my recognition that I cannot be free without others being free. But even that vision of what freedom is complicated. And so I guess I'm curious to hear from all of you about, you know, what that relationship between rebellion and freedom has meant for you or has given you, if anything. You know?
I mean, I'm still grappling with that, having finished the work. But in terms of just thinking through these two concepts, the safest landing for me would be thinking through practices of freedom. And in practices of freedom, it's not about looking into the redemptive aspirational freedom in the future that's yet to come, but it's being mindful of the past and the present and looking at, we know, the self-diagnosis, whether it's the ANC or whether it's the movement in terms of what hasn't been achieved, but also evoking yourself in that moment and saying, what must be done, knowing what I know now, what must happen. And this for me speaks to, I mean, Sharlene evoked bell hooks, and I'm a fan in one way or the other. I mean, hooks in two texts, the other one in 1990, the other one in 1996. In the first one, 1990, talks about the idea of the radical black subjectivity. And in that, it says, we shouldn't necessarily focus on always opposing these ideas of what dehumanizes us, that actually the task at hand is in constructing ourselves towards self-actualization. And later on, 1996 and 2009, they write a piece, Oppositional Gaze, Black Female Spectatorship. And in that piece, they talk about this idea of the oppositional gaze. But what I like about that concept is you're forced to look into this work that projects blackness, whether you are implicated in it or not, but you're forced to say, how do I relate into this cultural production of blackness from my own standpoint? So for me, it speaks to self-accountability within a context, being mindful of where you are more than just dreaming into these, futures of freedoms. Yeah.
So when I think about freedom and rebellion, I think what comes to mind is intuition. I think that rebellion is not something that I was intentionally ever really trying to do, but it was because there was a sense, like a bodily sense, that certain things were not how they needed to be. And I think that that's what draws me close to feminism a lot of the times. It's the idea that things don't have to be the way they are. And I find that it's also in paying attention to my own sensitivity, and trying to imagine that things can be different. I've never really been satisfied with the answers that, older people as I was growing up were giving me. So when I think of freedom, it mostly means to me, I kind of envision somewhere where I can move in the world without being boxed. And how I sense that I am boxed is that when I ask a question or when I do something that has people asking me questions as if it's abnormal, why are you wearing this? Or, things of that nature. That's when I really start to sense that actually we're not really free. I think for me, it's been a realization that, kind of growing up, we were sold the idea that there are no more obstacles, we can vote, women are in the workplace, things are great. And I think that feminism for me has been about really paying attention to the times that I don't feel free, even if it's not like a legal oppression or something quite explicit. And it's also been about recognizing that there's actually a lot of people who are also lacking freedom in their own way and just being dissatisfied with all of that.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you. I think, for me, it was quite similar to what Gorata has said, because, like I said, I think I started to turn to feminism when I was a teenager, and it was because I needed to hear and to see somebody else tell me that I'm not crazy for not celebrating the so-called freedom that I'm supposed to have and to be in, that I'm not crazy for thinking there's something wrong with a picture of me being one of very few fortunate Black girls that got into this space, and just seeing that there's something profoundly wrong with that, that I'm supposed to somehow celebrate that, not only celebrate it because it means that I get to change from being so kasi or whatever, and but also celebrating that I'm the only one you know, that there's hundreds of girls who would give their left arms to be here right now, you know. So I was always so unsettled by that, and I was a child, and I wanted to fight it, and I didn't even know how to even start. And every time I went home, and I said, but maybe this is something that we should change, like, let's do something. And everyone would be like, what's wrong with you? you know, so rebellion was, just as Gorata said, intuition for me. It wasn't, you know, I had always, before that time, thought of myself as a good girl. I was always praised to be a good girl, doing good things, you know, doing things with my life that I'm supposed to be doing, until I started to ask questions about my freedom and about other people's freedom that are around me. And that's when the rebellion kicked in, and I like it. I like knowing, you know, I like looking at things that everybody else sometimes thinks is normal, you know. I'm also remembering a time when I was working in a corporate space, and again, it was culture, it was normal. A lot of the things that were happening, the way that women were addressed and treated, and I was just like, but it's not. It can't be, you know. And now, because there are all of these feminist women around me, whether through novels, you know, through reading Tsitsi Tsangaremba, or through getting an article that's been written by Pumla Gola, is where I see that, okay, so I'm not the only crazy person here. We all know that we're vying for something here. And at the end of it, which will be our demise, obviously, but at the end of it, there will be freedom. You know, we probably won't need to exist so much as feminists if we get there in our lifetime, but we're going towards something that will be good for everyone, even the misogynists. So, yeah.
So I think, you know, we always talk about, you know, the public and the private, and they've always been, you know, so intertwined. So at least for the first sort of 17 years of my life, I grew up under apartheid. And so it was, you know, it's sort of etched into my consciousness, that whole thing of being segregated in an Indian township and what that meant, and all of those sort of limitations it placed. And those limitations were just not, you know, racial ones. It was, you know, being an Indian Muslim with a Christian mother, and so all of that sort of ethnic categories, the religious categories, and this person who then wanted to study visual arts, and everybody telling you, well, you can't because, well, what are you going to do with art? You know, nobody does anything with art. And so having this hopeless dream, having a family where nobody studied, studied before, nobody went to university before. And so, you know, and constantly feeling like, okay, all of these boxes exist. Now what are you going to do? And so freedom meant a lot of different things at that time. And so breaking out of each one meant defying some kind of expectation that was set for me in terms of one thing or the other. But they were always so intertwined. And I think, I didn't know the word intersectionality back then. And so the moment that you hear of this concept and you hear the word, that you just, it sort of gives you breath, it gives you life. It's like, oh my God, okay, I don't have to use this word, race, class, gender, sex, nationality, religion. There's this word intersectionality. It just saves you so much, right, of time. So freedom and rebellion sort of go hand in hand with the sort of personal investment in breaking out of all of these categories that sort of said what you could and could not do, right? Invested both in terms of your own life, but also in terms of the politics of the country as well. And then every time I sort of opened my mouth to speak, right? Because I had a unique education in terms of the University of Durban Westville at that particular time that had this very Africanized curriculum, and so it set me up for a great sort of life. But it meant that somehow every time I opened up my mouth, I somehow came into this clash with other people who were not from that space, who were not in that conscientization. And I inevitably became this willful child who suddenly grew up and became the feminist killjoy. And you don't know what's wrong with you, why people hate you every time you open your mouth. And so you think that you're the problem, and then you think what's going on with you, until finally you discover the work of Sarah Ahmed. And it was by grace that I happened to be at a physical lecture by her. And I sat in the back crying. And as she said, "You are not the problem." And I just cried and I cried, and I realized, oh, I'm not the problem, right? And so I took that off of my body, and I realized the problem exists. And because you point out problems, you are made to be the problem. And so I took that off of myself, and then I realized, okay, so feminists, there's this concept, feminist killjoy. I'm a feminist killjoy. I'm the black feminist killjoy. I'm going to embrace this term. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to be this thing. If you want to call me the angry black woman, whatever, but we're going to deal with this. And so if we are all going to get, whether it's my individual freedom, and that's going to always be attached to a collective freedom, so be it. Let's go.
So there's a theme of like good girls going bad. You're like, I'm good. And it's like, no, you're not. And you're like, oh. But I think it's connected to this personal political work. And I think collectively we all have a lot of ways that we reflect. So with people who get to think through our experience and the experience of others, as our job. So there is that process of thinking and theorizing, but also that there must be a connection to action or a praxis. Like, you mentioned, like, who do I love? How do I love? So there's also how do you practice every day? But also we all come from places or families who may not have been like, hey, we're a feminist family. But even the word itself is like qualified, not white feminism. Or so even the language itself, the word itself may be something people are allergic to because it sounds like it's not rooted in our experiences, or it's alienating, or it seems like only things that people are studying can talk about. And so I'm wondering, in your own practice, what does it mean to do that translation, whether you're in the classroom as a teacher or you're, engaging in political action in a movement, or you're at church, or so that all of these places require you to translate not only who your own being, but also what your relation to feminist work is, or feminist action, because they may shift in those locations because you'd be talking to yourself if it was always monolingual, you know what I mean? Tumi, you want to go first?
So you mentioned interpretation, and I'll think about it also as lifestyle. So I think at first, I'll put it in my church experiences. At first, it was just a matter of taking what everybody says is it and going with it, and I think I was fine. But once I started, so interpretation for me started this way. It was reading feminist work, and then afterwards reading and interpreting through a feminist lens. So it became something that I wore, and then it was something that I wore every day, and now it's there. It's habitually there. It doesn't ever come be, I never take it off. And it was such a bizarre experience to have that lens in church and opening the Bible to like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's supposed to be about, how how homosexuality is a sin and all of that. And then, something, just I'm just giving one example of one story that I've read and known all of my life growing up as a child. But now that I have this lens, this new lens, I read it and I saw in it so much injustice. And not just injustice in the way that people chose to interpret that story, because interpretation is also a choice. We can go one way when we interpret and we can go another. And a lot of the times we're convinced that it's interpreted that way because there is no other way to interpret, But for me, I realized that it was about lenses and seeing injustices and seeing how, there are certain people, and this must have started a very, very long time ago. People who are mournable and people who are not. People who are rapeable and people who are not. People who can be disposed of at any time and anybody can forget about them. And there are people who we cry for when they are disposed of, and we cry for the ways in which they are disposed. So yes, it is that. It's a lens for me to interpret, and it becomes a lens also now, even just watching the news or having a conversation with a friend, and listening to what it is that they're saying and how they're saying it. And now I'm having a lot of fights with my friends because I'm like, use the right language. If you say it this way, it's going to mean this. But if you say it another way, then, then we're actually being more open and more sympathetic to what's happening around us. And like I said, at first when I said feminism saved my life, it's because, then I could have been so closed up in this particular box of interpretation. And I would never have then been open to so many possibilities, and I mean possibilities in terms of being, the possible ways of being, of living. And now that I have this lens, I am able to see people who live and who are in a way that I am not, and appreciate that for the possibility that it opens up even for me. So it's a bit selfish, but I want to be in the open spaces that people have edged out for themselves, and I want now to be able to help them make those spaces even larger, so that we're all able to fit in. So yeah, that's interpretation for me is opening up spaces through a lens that allows us to.
Yeah, I think what Tumi said was just really, really powerful, and it reminds me of that Nikki Giovanni saying about finding the universal in the particular, and so rather than the other way where modernism had this idea of this one size fits all kind of grand narrative where we were all struggling to fit in. It's just it's that other way around, right? And so I think that's what for me feminisms is all about, and African feminisms are about, is this idea that there's a space for everyone, and so whenever I teach around feminisms and especially to a large class, there's always a group of people that instantly take to it, and there's always that group that comes in, whether it's men or women, that goes, well, I'm not a feminist. And then we start off with the basics. Do you believe in gender equality? Of course I do believe in gender equality. Do you believe that everyone should have the same economic standing, the same? And we go through the list. And by the end, and when we go through that list, there's yes. I'm like, well, that's feminism. And then they're like quite confused because, of course, it's not about the bra burning, it's not about this, and it's not about this. And so it's removing the kinds of the myths around feminism. It's removing sort of misunderstandings about it. But it's also sort of understanding that there's many different kinds of feminisms and that you can find a place for yourself. I also think that, locating texts where the lingo is also easy for people to find themselves and to have starter texts, throwing somebody into the deep end of a Judith Butler text, I don't think is the way to start in Gender Studies 101. It's an important text, don't get me wrong. But I think introducing people in step-by-step ways is part of that. And I think, also part of different sort of feminists is also that certain feminists have found that, it's important to have easy language but very critical discussions. And it's possible to do that so that whether it's a high school student or whether it's a university student, that you can bring them into the discussion, that we widen these discussions. So I think that for me is very crucial, is how do we widen these discussions? And when we are talking between ourselves as feminists, we can also then have those kinds of in-depth discussions where we are pushing those kinds of critical discourses, those methodologies, as Noma and I were speaking about a bit earlier, where we can push the critical discussions and discursive discussions that we want to have. But when we are having those discussions with larger groups of people, if we want to be inclusive, if we want this to be sort of a mass movement where we are changing society, then it is important for that to be happening on a popular level, not a dumbing down of the discussion, but an in-depth discussion that brings people into why gender equality and the changing of gender relationships, of an understanding around choice, and around bodily relationships, around social inequalities is super important, and the restructuring of social relationships. And I think when you understand how the importance of how the evolution of social relationships have happened around patriarchy, and why those need to change, and how the largest genocide of women and children is still occurring, then people understand the importance of those, and how that choice has to be extended to all vulnerable populations. When you understand that as feminist activity, and not about going out and what you are buying, and consumerism. As much as I love shopping, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of shopping, but not when it's just on the backs again of little children in Bangladesh or little children here and there. We have to care about those things, and so. I think feminism is in the particularity, it is in the popular, it is in the choices. We can't close ourselves off, that, oh yes, we are just going to save each other by just speaking to women, by just speaking as black people to each other. If we want to save society, it has to be a mass movement at the end of the day. I forgot what your question was.
I also forgot the question, but I'm inspired by the two responses. I mean, feminism it's as much a way of being, a way of life. I'm not trying to sell it as Christian, missionary. You have to live a certain way and actually recruit people into it. But in a sense, where you choose to spend your time, whether you are consenting to unpaid labor, a romanticized form of servitude in movements, or whether you are mindful of disrupting narratives within the family around gender roles with your nieces and nephews. But I enjoy feminism more as a tool, in saying how are we looking into things, as Tumi puts it, as a lens. I'm troubled, for example, with the idea that we have feminist methodologies. I appreciate what that does, because at the core of it, for me, feminism is about questioning, and it's about deepening that questioning and saying, what do we mean by feminist methodologies? Yes, we know it's a standpoint, but beyond that standpoint, what is it that we're trying to disrupt with it? And there's been different movements, some people moving from what others call the presence of absence, where we're trying to throw ourselves into, we exist, we did these things, even if the language was not there for us. But as Sharlene puts it, feminism now is popular. And for me, that's why it's important as a tool. If there are claims to feminist governments, if there are claims to celebrities being feminists, and if there are claims of solidarity transnationally, then we need to deepen the questions of feminism. What do we mean by this feminism? But also being mindful, of course, and not trying to define it in ways that are exclusionary. I'll try and be a little bit controversial here. For example, I don't mind the idea of replacing E in woman with a dash, or a hashtag, or a Y, or an X. But I don't understand the movement. I understand in this particular moment in South Africa that the X speaks to including trans identities. I welcome that, I support it fully. But I do not understand in terms of what it meant in the 1980s as a Y. And I do not understand it in terms of other disciplines as a dash. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's forcing me to pause and be mindful that when I write, when I speak, in trying to own Black womanhood, who am I excluding? And so for me, it's a tool of trying to make sense of inequalities. And again, it depends, which Googles you wear. Are you going through hooks and talking about the matrix of oppression, or you're going, as Sharlene puts it, intersectionality there by Crenshaw, or you're going there by Smith and saying, what is it, matrix of domination, if I'm not mistaken. So there's different ways for me in terms of cutting the cake up, and feminism allows me as a tool to say, how do we look at all these other issues? And yes, we might use particular language, but what do we really mean by it? In the politics of naming, the first piece that I wrote, and I actually was proud of, was questioning the idea of calling Black same-sex practicing township-based women lesbians. And I was like, why? Why is it easy to say lesbians, whether it's research or advocacy? And the work that I did was trying to find, how do people actually identify themselves? We know what lesbian means, but how do we use it in trying to render this visibility in different forms? And the women that I spoke to in Soweto, lesbian obviously was out of 17 categories that I found in the literature and also in conversations. Different names came out. The other one called themselves Pink or Skezonga, and I'm like, what is that? And it's like, it's a code. When you're in public, you want to talk about yourselves without really outing yourselves. But lesbian was really high up. So people do identify with this term, but I think it's because it's accessible, not so much of meaning or identifying it, but we all know what it means. And then the interesting one was queer. And how people even pronounce it, like, what's that? What's this queer thing? And so for me, it's about being mindful, speaking and writing from a space of mindfulness in terms of not just the power of relations, but what do we mean when we make these claims? What do we mean in these overarching, analysis? We speak of patriarchy, and beyond, again, the diagnosis, what do we do with it? I'll stop there for now.
Danai, what was the question?
Translating between theory and practice.
Okay. So I have a lot of thoughts, because you've inspired a lot of thoughts in me. But I think when you were asking the question, I was thinking about my sometimes uneasy relationship with feminists, with the label, and also kind of changing relationships with that label, because I feel like it's transitioned into a lot of things. So there was a time when, I don't know if we're still in that time, where being a feminist was something controversial. It was taking a particular kind of stand. And then later on, like in more recent times, you can go to like any shop and there's like 5 "The Future is Female" t-shirts. And so it kind of, I used to relate to it as a way where I could find people who believed similar things to me. And I've had to really think about lately, if everyone can wear it on a t-shirt, but we didn't have a discussion about it, what does it all mean? So I think for me, that change has made me kind of see that feminism itself will always be changing, and relating that to what Tumi was saying about feminism being kind of a personal work, I think that it can still be something that encourages me to always like look inside and see what is the next step, who's being excluded, and where am I in that matrix of things. I think another thing that's had to be a conversation is the idea that feminism is a Western concept. And, I know several people who don't identify as feminist, even though you might take them through the checklist and see, do you believe in all these things? And then you say that's feminism, and they're like, but I don't identify with that term. I've also had to think about how do I relate to those people and try to understand why that label might not be home for people who want the same things as me. And for a lot of people, there's also like thinking of translation, just the idea that it's a Western thing because it's an English concept. And being in the academy, I have to think about this because it can be a difficult space to be in. It often feels like you have to prove something to exist there as a Black person. And in teaching feminism, I also want to think about, teaching it in the formal sense, I think about what do I need to do as someone who's so close to the label to be able to give someone the experience that I had whenever I encountered the word. And I find that I'm not as attached to the label anymore because I think that it doesn't help to kind of try make everyone, it goes against the principle of freedom if you're trying to make everyone a feminist. But I think it's trying to translate that feminism is also a commitment to each other and a commitment to really thinking about how we treat each other, and insisting that we can treat each other way better than what's currently happening.
There's two things that ring for me about what feminist work does, even when I'm not operating with that term. I guess when I'm engaged, I'm like enraged with racism, and or something that is happening. That is when I'm engaging in different forms of injustice. For me, the two things come up. It's part of it is what, in terms of identifying with others, is experience, because I think when you recognize an experience you're having as shared with another person, then it's like, one, it can make you feel quite helpless because it's like, oh, so this is just going to keep happening then. But also it's like, oh, I'm not crazy. And I think that's important. But I think for me, it's also been that, like, what does it mean to love? I think we sort of don't have really intense ways of loving each other. There's intense ways of loving each other. Let's not make a mistake. The songs can tell us a story, but ways that, like, the work of committing to even loving ourselves we're so alienated from ourselves, living in this kind of racist, patriarchal, capitalist system where we don't even know how to interpret our own feelings about something. Something feels funny and you don't even know what's going on. You got to get 5 professionals to help you interpret it. When it's like, no, the air is wrong. So I think that like learning that practice of love is and engaging in what, so you're walking through the world and you're also taught to shut things down, because the only way you can accept things being normal is just you have to close your eyes and close your heart and then close your mind. And this, so I think it's, that's just my 5 cents. The other thing you said about like the popularity of feminism now, so there's this, I feel, because people can identify, so there's this kind of popular feminism that's in the air. And so I can have my T-shirt, when I was like, I remember back in the day when you had to go online and make the T-shirt, and then you order it and it costs so much money, it was like a precious thing, and now it's like, oh no, it's mass produced by small children in, the global South country that you can access cheaply. And so there's a way that, and I think that it's producing several kinds of things. So there's a way that the term feminism, even the fact that a lot of, across the globe, a lot of the figures we see as representing feminist work are African women or Black women. So we have this moment where we have this kind of overuse of our image and representation as kind of feminist people across the globe that makes I think it makes it accessible in some ways, or makes, so we can start to name the people or visually trace ourselves through them, at the same time as it also produces. So there's that over familiarity where now I don't even know how to say. Ooh, I've heard you say Nikki Giovanni. I've heard you say Bell Hooks. I've heard you say all these things. So there's also this question around, my feeling and wanting to articulate something that's rooted in my experience, everybody talking like they know, and also this kind of even the expertise, like, so if like the tool, when you're talking about wearing it, so now you're there walking together and you're like, yes, me too, Chimamanda, and then this person's like, no, let me score you on your lens, because so that's also a punishing, it's almost and maybe it's also part of how femininity is learned, we punish each other. And so there's something punishing and fearful about thinking through or negotiate. That's not simply like I reject the label, but it's like I feel I'm going to reject it before it rejects me, right? And so I'm wondering, how does one in the present, where African women, let's say 20, 30 years ago, when they were like thinking that they're coming to teach us feminism, and then people were like, sit down, sister. This also happened, around historically, where people think African women need to be taught, and now it's like, no, we are the faces, and then, and so there's this. I think it creates a tension in terms of how people experience their own place in the name, or in identifying. That's not just about like the language is insufficient, but it's also like, it's far in this way, if I don't know the names, or I don't know the tools, or I make mistakes, or I'm going to love my weird boyfriend, So I'm going to just revisit the previous question. So I think we're living in a time now where Black and African women are literally, we're the image and representation of what popular feminism comes to be, easily consumable, buy the book, but also, so even the face, I have a relative who's a novelist, who's not a Black person, whose main protagonist is a queer Black feminist woman in their work, for example. So there's a way that we come to embody a particular kind of desirable object of feminist action as Black and African women. And I think it happens also in an environment where people are also, like, as we enter it, the first thing, maybe it's also what's happening in this kind, it's not just popular feminism, but I guess the moment across the globe now, across movements, where I guess popular movements in Africa also shape how other people do political action or are able to find language. And that shifts things from a place where people think that African women need to be saved, but also that, that there is no African feminism. Now we have the people doing the work of saying, no, we have these long histories of African feminist activism, African feminist thinking, African feminist representation and writing, so we can trace these histories and think about the different kinds of movements that we've occupied, or that, our ancestors have occupied. And so there's ways that we can, that the ground of the foundations of African feminisms are becoming available to the world, but also are being consumed. And so operating in this world, it seems there's a pressure for all of us. You're just walking in your woman body and you're like, and you must identify with feminism, because it's also part of because we come to represent, even just, I was listening to a random playlist the other day, and so much of what was being expressed in music was around Black women's place in kind of very feminist discourses, which I don't disagree with. There's ways that we've been doing feminist work, even if it's not named as such, across territories. And so, but that explicit naming and that popularization of feminism also means our contradictions as feminist people, as queer people, as Black people, also are things we're wrangling with in our everyday experience in much more explicit ways, because you just be living your life, but you're meant to look like or behave or be representative of something, of a set of ideas that people may not have. Our expert knowledge is various. There's vernacular knowledge of like music videos and feminism, or reading novels. There's different vernaculars of popular feminism that are in place, and we all converge, I guess, in our representation as African feminist people. And I think the contradictions of our differences, the differences you mentioned when you're like talking about the T-shirt, may not always appear when we all want to touch the same thing, right? So what does it mean for wanting to touch the same thing? But sometimes what's anxious about touching the same thing, or makes us anxious, is because now I'm not the one doing my PhD in sexual violence at Wits, and now I'm feeling like if I don't come with your knowledge, then I'm feeling like that interaction is tense, but I don't know how to articulate it. I think that's also part of what the popularization of African feminisms has done. We all want to touch it, but we don't touch it the same way. And then that expertise, the range of our expertise it becomes another translation problem.
No, I think we shouldn't shy away from contradictions. I think we need to sit in those as a process of learning, because there are different strands even within African feminisms, whether you're trying to trace the history in West Africa through literary scholarship, or in South Africa in looking at the 1997 celebration of Agenda in 10 years, where there was a discussion around race, that it's nice to talk about sisterhood, but how do we talk about race? Those conversations continue to this day, because in South Africa we also inherited the labor within our movements, where lobbyists are experts and they come with other categories of difference. And then the one that sings in the front of the match and shouts Amandla occupies a different space in terms of how knowledge is shared and how change is conceptualized. And I think we need to sit in those contradictions to say, you and I are Black feminists, but I might not necessarily believe in the idea that I do. But I might not necessarily believe in the idea that love is freedom. But I should be able to sit in that and say, what do you mean by that? And not from a space of being a gatekeeper, but in trying to make sense of it. Like I said before, for me, it's about questioning. And we can only learn, not through affirming ourselves and finding people who are similar to us and, who just affirm our egos and you boost our self-esteem. I think that's useful work. But what are we trying to do with that? So you're speaking from what space? And that's why in all the strands of feminism, whether you're looking at it in theology, or whether you're looking at it in governance and local government, or you're looking at it in performative ways and in the arts. For me, Black feminism allows me to have conversations with all feminists across different points, because I'm always mindful of what becomes marginal. And so for me, anyone can be in the same space. And I always say, like church, for me, social movements have a space for everybody else, the whores, the drunkards, and the thieves. And so if we're saying then feminism is a way of thinking through change, then we shouldn't be necessarily trying to change people in terms of who they are. We should be trying to change, exclusionary ways of being that are oppressive to other beings. So I'm not out here trying to workshop people into feminism. Feminism, it's a quiet song in my heart, but it's a practice where I have to say, who is excluded? What becomes marginal?
Yes, and I agree so much with what you're saying, and I'm so glad that you keep circling back to talking about who it is that we're excluding, even when we're in our best place, because I think the marking of difference, and I'm so glad that I read Audre Lorde. I read Audre Lorde, I think, for the first time last year, and I've just held on like so fast, because that's exactly what she wrote about, throughout her collection of essays. And I think there's always that I'll call it a temptation to use difference as a marker that tells us who's better than, or who deserves the space more than another person. So and that's why I think that when we do feminist work, and that's why I do the same thing, is that it's always internal work first, because sometimes we have our own biases, that inform what can or can't be, and looking at say the there was a time, I think, when a celebrity was placed on I think it was a Cosmo magazine cover, and then they put the word activist next to her, and everyone just went crazy. It was just like, okay, activists, how dare, because like Danai was saying, there's a certain face, a certain action, a certain way of being, a certain lifestyle that informs what activism is. And I don't know, a very pretty girl that's been pushing a life of pretty for quite some time probably doesn't quite fit that, So it's a look. There are a lot of activists that I think are pretty. Let me just say that, okay? But pretty is not their first and foremost label, or it comes after. Like, oh, she's quite pretty, So, but I think, and I'm now no longer speaking to this Cosmo cover, but I think that sometimes it's our own biases, it's our own I don't know our first reaction to resist it, to say this can't be it, she can't be it, they can't be it, not me, not what I stand for. They can't possibly stand for that because they're not saying the right things, they're not doing the right things, they're not. But again, and that's why I quoted Audre Lorde, because then she says, look, that's internal work for you. That's when you want to resist somebody who wants to hold on to the life that you say that you live. When you resist somebody who says, oh, but I am a feminist, the work, I think, is on us then internally to think back and say, but why am I resisting this person? Am I using the difference between us as a marker to say, oh, but then I am better than you. You are lower than me when it comes to this space. You may be the pretty girl, but in this space, baby, Or am I using, or am I going to look at difference as a way that we can both embrace this this belief, this life that we want to live, and find ways to walk in it together, even as we are different. Am I using difference as a celebration and as to open up possibilities, or am I again falling back into the very socialized trap of a difference of capitalism that says, I am rich because you are poor, and I am feminist because you are dumb and you haven't read all of the great books that I have read, Because then if we're using it, in that very capitalist and patriarchal way, then I think our internal work needs more work. We need to go back again and work again. And I think it's Maya Angelou that always says, it's unfinished work, it's unfinished work. And yeah, so I am not claiming to have finished my own internal work. But yeah, I think asking that question regularly, how we use difference as our marker, will keep bringing us back to making sure that we do not play a role in the exclusion of people.
I think, thinking about your question, what comes to mind is colonialism and how it's really difficult to, I guess, get rid of colonialism. And I think something I've noticed for myself is that it seems harder to a certain extent to point out and rid our communities of colonial thinking because it's no longer legislated. It's almost like it's in the air, but you can't really point it out. And in that context, I've thought about my own kind of defensiveness when other people weren't feminist, like they were doing it to me, like they were not being a feminist. And I was like, this hurts. Why would you do this? And I think it's also important to think about to be honest about our own power relations, because I think a lot of people come into feminism after being oppressed and realizing that things are not okay. And I think it's very possible, because things are so unequal at present in our current society, to also cling to things in a way which reproduces the kinds of power dynamics that we don't want to actually emulate. And that's true for anything. And I think that, within African countries, you have, the takeover of the governments by Black leaders, and then they enact the same kinds of violences of colonialism. It's the same ways we need to really interrogate our methods, because it really takes a lot of imagination to imagine a new way of doing something. You have to recognize that something's wrong and think of something new to do in place of it. So when I think about that weaponization that can sometimes happen, or the defensiveness, I think of it as an indication that there really is a lot of work to do. And that what's difficult in this moment for me is that a lot of the work is invisible, because there's so many freedoms that some women and some people do have. And then it's kind of really looking for something that is, I guess, invisible or in the air or insidious, and then trying to identify it and think of something else in its place. It's a big challenge, I think.
I think, part of it for me has always been that I never, when I was at university at least, there wasn't gender studies courses. So there wasn't any possibility for me to do any gender studies courses as such. And so coming to feminism was really about tracking down these kinds of books, finding people who knew about them, and then going to the back of bibliographies and seeing, okay, this and this and this. So you basically found stuff by yourself. This was, well, I'm saying pre-internet because stuff took long to arrive back then to our spaces. And so I still, I've never attended any gender studies course. So it was just making up stuff for myself. And so I don't claim to be any expert on any sort of feminism except on myself. And I know some stuff about people that I know and some stuff about my community. But the thing is, the higher up, the more and more you study, the more and more you realize you know so little. And by the time you end up with that PhD, you feel embarrassed about how little you know about the world, right? To the fact that you go around with this imposter syndrome. And it's a very healthy space to be, because you realize you are not an authority on anything, but you do know a little bit about little bits of stuff. So when somebody else comes along and tries to be an authority, it's like, no, you're not an authority on me, and you're not an authority on my people, so literally fuck you, okay? So you don't get to tell me about myself, at least, and you don't get to tell me about my family and what's happened in my family. And so from the time I was very young, all of my research came out of basically trying to write about the people around me that that I was trying to find in books that were not there, and I was told that they didn't exist. But if they kept studying and they were around me, where were they keep disappearing to? So even when we set up our African Feminisms conference, Linda Gichanda Spencer and myself and Tando and Giovanni, it came out of not being an expert on African feminism, because God knows I don't think any of us were, and those are this is none of our speciality. There's so many more people that are well versed in this. it came out of just being upset that there was not such a platform in this country for the amazing scholars that we have, and that there should be an African feminism conference. And we just had, at that specific time, funds to be able to do it, or we were able to pool resources together to be able to do it. And that was all that there was. And we had the goodwill to be able to do it. That was all. There was no expertise. And I think that has held us in good stead, that we were just able to create the platform for it. And that's been the basis for African feminisms. It's been the basis for the Black Feminist Killjoy reading group that we've done. And I think it fundamentally comes out of a love for women of color and the greatness of what they do, that despite the fact that we might not have economic resources, we are amazing at what we do, and out of the love of what we generate and what we can do. And so I'm not sure about the word experts, but I know that we, out of love and creativity, we generate so much. And I think that's why visual arts is the great basis from which I operate, and why I do the kinds of things that I do is because from the terrain of visual arts, which is an incredibly elitist platform, I'm able to see how people are able to proliferate that platform and say, well, actually, you don't get to dictate, because creativity is not a white man's category. Creativity has existed across the world, and we can't explain why human beings do what they do. They completely exceed the functional and go into the aesthetic, and it's just for the love of it. And it's one of the most beautiful things in work, if you just stop and think about it for more than 2 seconds, that we all just defy the functional in just the way that we look today, right? And so it's a beautiful terrain that every day we defy, and we are always more than we are. And so that doesn't require expertise. Nobody's an expert on why we do what we do. We just do it, right? And so that's the terrain from what I operate. And I think the fees must fall moment was so important because, as you get older, like, not these people, but me, right? Like, I'm 43 right now. And what the fees must fall moment taught, I think, some of us, was that we became arrogant at a certain point in thinking, oh, the selfie generation. The selfie generation doesn't know much. Oh, the selfie generation. That selfie generation that we didn't think knew so much. That same selfie generation can take 1,000 images of themselves, but they still knew bell hooks, they still knew Fanon, and they kicked ass. And they were able to do in practice what we were only talking about. They were able to kick down doors. So for me, I don't trust in experts. I trust in what people can do. And people can do a lot in a moment when they get more angry and they demand justice than all the theorizing can do.
So I did do women and gender studies at university. But it was a coincidence because I was a biochemistry major. I was going to be a doctor, like the medical kind, a psychiatrist eventually. And then, but I had this rebelliousness that I was like, maybe this feminism thing might be my answer. Because also I was like, why have I not read women in school? Why have I not read Black people? So I did Africana studies and women's studies on the side because I was like, you can't have a curriculum in Africa where you don't read a Black person's work or a woman's, or Black women's work. You read, Charlotte Bronte, white women were there, but there was it was like Black women had never existed. So that was what drew me. But I remember, I'm getting I'm meeting Sister Outsider, and I'm like, oh yes, oh dear Lord, I'm feeling you, and I'm reading all this, but I feel this weirdness because, and I start to argue with my father in particular, who talked about his grandmother who grew up with us also, and she was this woman. She's like, he's like, when you'd hear her in the rules, she would get up and you hear her go, zhoo, zhoo, and everybody fixes and he's like, no, she was a feminist. None of this little baby reading thing you're doing, And so we'd have these because he's like, why do you need this word or this way of this knowledge you're getting to talk about something that I grew up knowing, in the people and so we have that tension. But also, I'm also trying to be like, well, what can I, how could I be finding it in North America at school as opposed to my whole life? And I remember then reading Alice Walker's In Search of about these gardens, and then thinking about my own grandma, things I learned, like how to grow food, which is, I believe, like the fact that we live in a world where we don't know how to grow our own food, grow food, to raise chickens, to, to basically to live with the earth in a way that is not destructive. These are things my own grandmother taught me, how to cooperate in terms of liveness, that it's also about like that now we're saying, oh, we're calling it what's it now? There's all these, there's an ancestral turn, now we all suddenly have a calling, and all these things that are coming up in the present. But these are lessons that were part of my everyday life growing up, that didn't have that name, but were people's vernacular practices of resistance and survival against colonialism, against dispossession, against racism, against patriarchy that people have, that I grew up being taught, but they weren't. So I'm wondering, I guess, if I think about that, those practices of living and of love and of being with one another that inform then how I'm shaped.
Can I just stop you there 1 second, because you are onto something here. But before you move on, because you are talking about your own biography, can I ask you, because you are in the Department of African Literature, so what role, for instance, has African literature had in terms of your own engagement with feminism? Because, if I had to think about my own trajectory, African literature has had, and you mentioned it in terms of Tsitsi Dangaremba and stuff, but African literature has had more of a powerful influence and even visual arts. So I would be curious to hear about that in terms of you.
Absolutely. So I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, that's how I got into. I mean, like, I want to read Black women and African women's work, because it's like, why do I live in a world where, like I said, the high school I went to was an all girls, like similar to your experience, all girls school, and then the representations of like, we had, so our school like houses were named after George Eliot, Charlotte Bronte, Margaret Irwin, and Jane Austen. Those are the images of not only feminism but also women's liberation, but also like what creates. So for me, the hunger for representation, I think, and I think maybe we take representation for granted as we become. You're like, oh, now we see, I know all the Black women, so now I take it for granted. But that hunger to be like, just one. Even Dangarembo was not being read in the curriculum when I was growing up in Zimbabwe. And like, it was. And so for me to go read Nervous Conditions in America was a confusing situation for me. And I'm having to, so I think that so teaching in African literature, where the world is Black, because also we take for granted that we live in a world where the things we're taught from the minute we go from the mother's breast onwards orient us to a world that is white, and we have to find our own ways of like marking out space that isn't marked by that universal of experience. And so to go into a world where the world not only mirrors what you and your family may look like, but also makes sensible the fact that the world that you're meant to confine your body, dress into, walk into, speak into, that world is a construction that is overrepresented as what it means to be human. I think that's what African literature has done and enabled conversations where the ways of being human that not only look like the things that look like the ways that I'm operating or living in the world, but also that challenge the norms that are very violent. We accept very violent norms. We accept that it's normal to drive past someone standing on the street looking for food, and we accept these things that we're made to accept that make us sick, all these weird illnesses we have. So I think reading in African literature where those questions are on the heart of it, because the worldview is not simply accepting that we need to accept these things that are wrong, I think has enabled a lot of those questions, enabled forms of experience that I can identify with. But I think also that reading Nervous Conditions is a trip. I hadn't read it for a while, and then I taught it again 2 years ago, and I was just like, to do this to other people's children. It's very intense, because you realize how crazy it is to you're living in this body where you are in feeling that insanity that sometimes you feel when you have a breakdown is real, because we have these nervous conditions living in these worlds where we have to undo our bodies all the time to survive. It's 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 I don't know how to explain how that, so it's not just representation that's, oh, this is familiar, I get you, girl. It's like, no, I'm living in this body where I have to deny what my body feels and what I know in order to survive it and be a good accountant and, get the right house and marry the right man and produce a life that makes no sense to my spirit. That's just my 4 cents. Yeah. But I had a question before, but now it's gone. But we can just go around.
It's really important, I mean, what you just said, because, Fanon's speaking about the racialized, everyday, psychical trauma that happens is we at the point at which we are saturated right now with imagery, right? And we take that for granted, and loads of representation. And as I said, growing up under apartheid, it's so different now to have those kinds of representation, your Issa Rays and all of that. But or even in South Africa, you said you're studying soap operas at the moment, Gomorrah and all of that, but to not even have had that growing up in a way, or to have had that sort of slapstick. Kind of comedies back then, and to always have to identify with whiteness, and so to have. And when we're speaking about freedom, was to read something like Tsitsi Dangaremba and to come across that character, and even though it's somebody in Zimbabwe, to just have a little girl character at the center of a plot was some kind of freedom that it just gave you breath, even as it was traumatizing at the same time. And that's the door that African literature opened up. But I mean, we still can't take it for granted in this right-wing world that we are living in, right? That every single one of those moments of freedom is being clawed back violently by the right wing across the world, in this country, right across the world. And Noma was talking about the fact that how we argue with each other, how we contradict each other, and are still able to argue in love is so important, right? I mean, I'm talking here about children working in Bangladesh and stuff. This is a Zara outfit. I don't know if the Zara outfit, it was very cute when I bought it and at half price, but I don't know if it was made in Bangladesh. I'm a bundle of contradictions, but I'm the only person working in my family, so I can only afford to buy cute things like this when they go on sale. So those are the economic realities of things as well. We want to talk, and I'm outing myself here because these are the kinds of real things we must discuss here, right? This is what everyday feminisms look like, right? That we are these bundle of contradictions, right? That there are violent patriarchs within feminisms as well, that they are homophobic patriarchs. And this is why even Tumi speaking about how we reconcile ourselves with the religions that we follow, with the men that we love, with the women that we love, with the pan choices that we make and stuff is really, really important.
No, bless. Thank you for that, Sharlene. I mean, for me, it's the idea of representation, because yes, there's been much work in terms of trying to fill in the void and making ourselves visible, and I think that work still has to continue, whether you're looking at statistics in government and how data is being collected, or whether you're looking at it in accountancy and so forth. But I think the issue for me is accountability amongst ourselves. It's not so much continuously working through the gaze of the other. We know what we are capable of. We have inhabited black worlds. In my own experience, I never had any sense of whiteness until a particular age. My entire world was black. And so my coming into whiteness does not begin from a sense of alienation. It comes from a space of strangeness. But then again, correctly so, you've articulated in terms of how that socialization in itself becomes a space of displacement, even though you're certain in your gut in terms of the black world, the things that you know for certain, whether how to make pap and steam it for 20 minutes and make sure it's proper and soft, and all these other things. But again, if you look at it within the context of economic justice, we pushed through gender mainstreaming in post-1994 South Africa, but now we're faced with the idea, what do they call them? Golden skirts, where you have overrepresentation of black women occupying boards and all these other categories of power. As Dumi also places it, it's about being mindful of the capitalist formations in how feminism is being co-opted in different forms. So on one end, we talk about the relevance of economic justice as a mitigating factor against gender-based violence, but we have not slave queens, we have the rich aunties. That it's also their time to chow. And we're okay and we celebrate that culture. And again, for me, that's the site of contradiction that we need to be able to sit in. Like, be pretty. Yes, you can afford what you're doing. If you want to buy a Ferrari for yourself on Valentine's because you're so independent, you don't need a man. But then what does that do in thinking through different changes? Are we just learning all these rebellious ways, or reciting all these injustices just so we can look cool, just so we can live in a safe suburb where it's okay to be queer? And so for me, again, going back to the idea of, yes, representation, and yes, we must occupy where we can, and take violently if it's necessary, because, exclusionary politics are violent in themselves. But we need to return to a point where we say, now that we've decided to be those violent beings, what do we make of ourselves? So I don't believe, for example, in disagreeing with you, and then at the end of it, it's okay for me to say, futsek, you're being respectable. What does that do in pushing the conversation? So you can be radical, but in mindful ways that push the conversation, and not just for the sake of performing radicalism by actually, again, excluding other people and just, being feisty publicly. But where are we trying to land with all these categories? And the definitions matter, and as Gorata said, they always change, but the language that we use, what are we trying to do with it? Because surely we cannot be theorizing for the sake of it. Yes, art is art is art, theory is theory is theory, and it's okay to have that space. But for some of us who are interested in dreaming about, social justice and dreaming about alternative forms of freedom, we must go beyond that and say, yes, art is art, but writing or speaking or evoking black womanhood also requires me to be accountable and say, I hold certain privileges, but let me not kid myself just because I have a working class background and, well, maybe I have a car and maybe I'm renting in a proper place, therefore I'm middle class. I need to be able to sit in that discomfort and say, am I, during COVID, am I really middle class? Instead of sitting in this privilege with so much shame, I need to be able to sit, at least for me, Black feminism allows to say, acknowledge the power you hold in certain forms, but you also need to be mindful in a South African context, in this continent, you hold this power from the periphery. And don't kid yourself about it. We're still very much on the periphery, despite the overrepresentation in certain parts. In fact, it's used to pacify us. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so I'm just going to pick up on what each of you said, and I'm now remembering something that Danai said. Then it took me like 3 weeks before like a light bulb went off in my head, and then I wanted to find her and say, I get you. We were talking about transformation and what transformation actually means, when we finding Black women in spaces that did not have Black women before, and like you said, Noma, that how that can actually be a means of pacifying us. And I think a question was raised in that discussion where another woman said, okay, so then what do we do now? Like if one of us occupies the space of power and they start to act just like the men who were in that very same space towards us as women. What do we do? Do we deal with them the way that we're dealing with the men? Or do we, try to be more gentle about it, or do we just accept it? And I think the one thing that throughout that discussion that I remember Danai saying is that I think what we need to remember is that these people are sick. These spaces make us sick. And I just, and I didn't, I was like, what is she doing? Is she like, I don't know, is she apologizing for them? Like, what are we doing? Are we taking up arms? What are you saying, Danai? Why are you being so, and then I got it. I got it. And I think I got it again. Sorry, I'm going back to Tsitsi Tangaremba. I think I read an interview of hers, and she was speaking about this mournable body. And then she, and not in so many words, said that the spaces that we go into, that we try to occupy, that we try to survive in, Danai, as you said, mean also actually swallowing a sickness. Like we take violence because we've been living in violence, but then we also swallow violence, and then violence lives inside of us, and then we don't know any other way to be but violent. So I got that, and I was like, okay, so then what do we do? How do we move away from that? And I think, Noma, you answered me in a way, by saying, what about the reckoning that we also have to do ourselves, even when we hold these little crumbs of power. What does that reckoning mean for us, and what will that reckoning then mean for the people that we claim to represent? When we are in these spaces, when we have the capital in our hands to do certain things that others are not able to do, and I think the first part of my reckoning is to recognize, and this at first used to make me like a little bit angry when people would be like, remember, you are so privileged because you're among the most highest educated people, and I'm like, I'm still poor. Don't tell me I'm not privileged. That's not privilege, I'm poor. But actually, in a way, even though it was coming from the wrong mouths and being done in the wrong way, I get it, and I'm willing to sit in my mirror and see that, and see that there is something that separates me from the women that I speak to, that I write about in my research, because there is that gap that's been caused by the fact that I have a certain level of education and they were not able to get there for many reasons, and those reasons all have exclusion in them. So, and recognizing also that I have, I occupy a certain sort of acceptability because I date men, I sleep with men, that there are women who are not able to make that sort of a claim, and it's something that I walk in just without even, that I take for granted and don't even think about, So I think that's where the reckoning comes. But then I think for now, because I am still very much unable to move too many things, for now, my reckoning is in language, and how my language has to always have an ethics of care. And that's what I'm learning to do now. That's my current project and current unfinished work, to learn that ethics of care. And I'm hoping that in swallowing that, that might undo the violence, even if it's just a little bit. And then when I project and I interact, then I will be able to do it in less of a violent way. and more of an inclusive way. And I think that, I don't know if we took that project, each one of us, I don't know, it might do something. It might push us somewhere beyond where we are now, in a better space than we are now.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about what we're reckoning with, each of us. And yeah, to try and really, I think, respond to the violence that we've had to internalize to have privilege as, I don't know. I think something I'm thinking about is how to deal with the violence that, as you said, we have to internalize to be in positions of privilege, particularly in the academy. And, you know, it is a reality that it's a form of privilege. It's not really deniable. And I think it makes it difficult because it's a contradiction. But I think that one way I'm kind of trying to deal with it is to try and only take account for what I am accountable for. So kind of giving colonialism also its due in the process, so that I'm not like using the methods of colonialism, you know, like you're not good enough, all the imposter syndrome stuff, to also beat myself down in that context, because it becomes very difficult where, you know, you wanted to be a feminist, now it's like you're woke, and now it's like it's like policing yourself, which is something I'm trying to work against, and I think something that I'm hoping will lead to whoever is in my classroom or whoever reads my work having a softer experience than the people who have come before me and myself.
Thank you. I'll only say mindfulness. Mindfulness as a practice of being in the world and playing with other children. But other than that, I think we must always push ourselves as Black women. I think we sit sometimes too much in celebrating and in being comfortable with small wins, because in as much as we can speak from our multiple subjectivities, the system remains. You know, whether it's the ANC regime that governs, we still have to reckon with the idea of what kind of political governance truly speaks to an inclusive sense of change that does not have orphans or has high rates of, you know, HIV or shortage of ARVs while we have vaccines and all these other contradictions we have in our system. I think it's just practicing mindfulness and choosing to be feminists and choosing to preach from a space of practice.
Yeah, I think if creativity is the thing that makes my heart beat, or the thing at which my heart started beating, I think that I'm going to go with Noma's thing that gender equality is the thing that is the song in my heart. So I think that's the takeaway for me from the session.